Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
How are you, buddy?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
Good. Government forecasts permanent housing shortage. Well, that's all you need to know, but you can break this down for us.
So, as we all know, Australia's rental affordability has never been worse. So we've got Australian tenants required to sacrifice a record share of their income to rent a house or home. And this follows, roughly 50% increase in rent since the pandemic. Now, last week, leading apartment developer Tim Gurner warned that Australia's rental crisis could last another 15 years due to a lack of supply, due to the nation's super strong population growth. And this week, to make matters even worse, the federal government's own advisory council, which is called the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, released its annual State of the Housing System report. And what it said was that the Albanese government's target to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years is not going to be met, and it's not going to be met by a very wide margin. So the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council has instead forecast that only 938,000 homes are going to be built over the next 5 years. Now, that's obviously, 260-odd thousand below what the government's housing target is. So we're not going to build nearly enough homes. They basically identify a whole bunch of factors. So firstly, construction costs have increased by about 40% since the pandemic. So it costs 40% more now to build a home than it did, say, 5 years ago. And as a result, homes are too expensive to build, so we build less of them. And it means that builders can't make a profit because it costs so much to build, and we've got to mark them up so much that people can't afford to buy them at those prices. So we build less homes. They also say that the official cash rate or interest rates are structurally higher than they were, last decade when we built, when we built a decent amount of homes. So just to put this into perspective, the federal government's target is to build 240,000 homes per year for the next 5 years. The single biggest year of housing construction in Australia's history was 225,500 in 2017. Now, that alone, in the biggest year in history of Australia's housing construction, we built 6% less homes than what the government has forecast every year for the next 5 years. Right, so it was always an unrealistic target. But the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council said that when we built that record 225,500 homes, the interest rate, the official cash rate was only 1.5%. And currently, after this week's interest rate cut, it's 3.85%. And they say that although interest rates are going to come down, they're not going to come down enough they're not going to come down to the levels we had last decade when we built a lot of homes, which means we're going to build less homes. So it's just another factor. They also said that we've seen a large number of construction firms collapse. So we've had record insolvencies in the construction industry over the last few years. So a whole bunch of builders have left the industry because they've gone bankrupt, which means you've got less builders to build homes. And finally, we don't have enough builders to actually build the homes. So we're suffering a massive labour shortage. And part of that reflects the fact that, home builders in Australia are competing for workers against infrastructure projects that all the states are running. So the upshot is we're not going to come within cooey of building enough homes. And just to put some numbers around, obviously I'm talking to a New South Wales and Queensland audience here. New South Wales is only forecast to build 65% of its target. So it's, according to the government's housing target, New South Wales is supposed to build 376,000 homes over 5 years, but it's forecast by the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council to only build 246,000. So that's only roughly 2/3 of its target. And for Queensland's going to do a little bit better. It's going to build 79% of its target. So Queensland's target is to build 246,000 homes over 5 years, but instead it's only going to build 194,000.
Right.
So it's going to miss, but it's not going to miss by as much. Now, to add insult to injury, we're obviously already in a rental crisis, right? After rents have risen by 50%, roughly since the pandemic. We've got vacancy rates at really low levels. We've got a lot of homelessness and people struggling to pay their rents. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council forecasts that new housing supply is going to remain below population demand for the entire 5 years. So every single year over the next 5 years, we're not going to build enough homes to keep up the population growth. This is according to the federal government's own advisory council. And it said that over that 5 years, we're going to add to the housing shortage by 79,000 homes across the country. So whatever shortage we've got at the moment, you can add another 79,000 homes to that. The upshot of all this, Phil, is that according to the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, the rental crisis is just going to continue and arguably get even worse. We're already in a rental crisis, and according to the federal government's own advisory council, this rental crisis is going to get worse because we're going to continue to have more demand through immigration and population growth than the nation can supply, which means we're just not going to build enough homes. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know what the optimal solution here is. If you can't build enough homes, you have to reduce demand. And the only way to realistically reduce demand, to bring demand back into line with supply, is the federal government has to slash immigration, right? Because they've got to reduce the number of people coming into Australia every year who require housing to a level that is commensurate with our ability to build that housing. Because according to the federal government's own advisory council, for the next 5 years, we're going to have more people coming into the country than we can build housing for, which just means that the housing crisis that we're currently experiencing is just going to get worse and worse. And this report comes against the backdrop of immigration data that came out last week, Phil, that showed that Australia's immigration is actually picking up again. It's actually rising again. So at the end of last year, it looked like it was starting to fall. But it was still at very high levels. But according to the September quarter last year, which is the official data that's come out, net overseas migration had fallen from about 550,000 per year down to about 380,000. But all the partial data that we've got since then, so whether it's the temporary visa data, the international student data, as well as the monthly permanent and long-term arrivals data that we get from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it's also the population data in the latest labour force release, they're all showing that population growth and immigration are now picking up again. We've got increasing immigration again at the same time as our housing supply is running at around a decade low, which just means that the rental crisis is just going to keep getting worse unless the federal government cuts back on immigration. It's really the only thing we can do to solve this rental crisis that's basically, steamrolling, people in Sydney, Queens, Brisbane, Melbourne, everywhere across the entire country. Yeah. It's the only thing we can do.
You were right, though, when it was a Freudian slip, but you said insult to industry, and you were actually right on that particular perspective as well. Give us a place where people can go and get some more common sense.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So if you want to hear this sort of analysis, go to macrobusiness.com.au. I write on the housing market, on the economy, interest rates, immigration, government policy, all these sorts of things every day.
Ready to grow your small business?